In case I can't see your eyes, it's because of the light, so let's blame it on that. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back at Bucknell. I come from Uganda, and just to be clear, one of the many countries in Africa, in fact, one of the many 50-some countries in Africa. It is a country blessed with immense beauty, such love from its people, and in fact, Winston Churchill called it the Pearl of Africa. Anyone from Africa here? Usually Africans don't like it when I say Uganda is the most beautiful country in Africa, so just want to make sure. You might also know it as the country that is competing with the US to be the worst at elections. In fact, Uganda holds the first place, and I think the US is really contending for second place. So if you actually look at these two pictures, you might have trouble telling which picture is from Uganda and which picture is from the US. Not something that you want to be involved in America. But having been in this country for a while, I truly believe that love and peace will trump our fear for anything and ignorance and all that. For a number of African countries, Uganda included, issues of poverty and less developed areas and corruption are not new. In fact, they are rampant. In the 19th century, Africa was called the Dark Continent. Why? Because no one knew anything about the continent. And fast forward to now, magazines are publishing this, Africa Rising. This is the new narrative. Africa is on the move. If you've picked up Economist magazine or New York Times, this is the new image of Africa. Very encouraging for all of us, especially for me, and very happy that we are seeing Africa in a new light. If you look at the Africa of today, you see that it is one of great potential. The numbers are amazing. It tells you in 2008, Africa had a GDP of 1.6 trillions, and we all know the Africa Revolution when it comes to mobile phones, that since 2000, there's been over 300 new subscribers, and it's encouraging, it's great. If we go and look to what Africa is tomorrow, you find that it's just as exciting. 2.6 trillions coming up in 2020 in terms of GDP, and by 2030, Africa, about 50% of the population will be in cities. What does that mean? If we go to Uganda, just Uganda, you see that the GDP has been growing really well. 6.5% average rate growth for the past few decades and years, and this is encouraging. Again, it tells the same story that Africa is growing, in particular Uganda is growing, so everything is good. Over this Africa Rising narrative, as it's been going on, a number of things have changed. We've seen an increase in multinational corporations across the continent, and a bunch of African countries have seen companies grow that have revenues of billions of dollars, and all this has been promising one thing, especially for the poor, that finally the poor will have an income that is usable, an income that is able to support their families. That is what charities and multinational corporations have promised Africa. But has that happened? Not so much. Development has changed in terms of stories that people are telling now. It's all about mobile phones. In fact, when I speak to people about Africa and development and I say the challenges we have, they're like, but people have phones. They look at the number of Twitter users and Facebook users and how many phones people have, and the fact that now in most African countries, we can actually move money through phones. You might know it here as Venmo, depending on your age, or Samsung Pay. And that's been the relationship. That's been the view of development across Africa. The fact that real income is what matters has sort of been sidelined. No one talks about what people have in their pockets and whether they can meet the needs of their families or not. And I think that's where the issue is. Now, in addition, Africa is seeing a huge increase in the youth. In fact, there's over 200 million youth in Africa. Of that, about 50 million are unemployed. More than half of them are illiterate. That's abstract. For me, not so much. Every time I call someone home and say, hey, what's up, what's going on? The next thing is, Muyambi, I'm unemployed. There are no jobs in Uganda. So this story is real. It's not the numbers anymore. It's real that people are unemployed and they need jobs. And that's where our charities, our multinational corporations have to start rethinking what Africa or where Africa is going. We have to create real jobs that put money in the hands of people that need it. I went back to Uganda recently, excited because, look, I'd been reading the news, just like most of you, seeing all the wonderful numbers and thinking, hey, I'm going to go back to a whole new world in Uganda. And for a moment it was. We have some skyscrapers. I know that's not a big deal for you, but this is a 19-story building in Kampala. We don't have too many of those, okay? So I know New York, you have way too many. But that, when I saw this, I was like, finally, this is great. There were, more new buildings where there used to be nothing, and it was looking great. I was excited about it. Finally, Africa is rising. But once I kept going to where I grew up, the slums I walked as a child, the slums I played in, that I inhabited, it was a different story. It seems there was a disparity between what I'd read and what most of us read here and what really was happening on the ground. The kids that spent their lives eating 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, they weren't really seeing this Africa Rising excitement that I hoped was showing up on the newspapers I was reading. So, to go deeper into that, when you look at Uganda in particular, over the course of period that I mentioned where it was growing at a huge rate, during that time, the income inequality was also increasing. Now, the economists in the audience will tell you income inequality is measured from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%, depending on what scale you want to use. During that time, the inequality in Uganda was growing. 1990, the income inequality was 0.32 or 32%. And in 2012, it was 0.42 or 42%. That means the money that's showing up as economic development, economic growth, isn't really dropping down to people's pockets. And in fact, even out of people that were seen as non-poor, more than half of those people in 2012 were considered to be insecure. Most of Uganda is full of farmers, and when you make an investment in sexy industries like construction and technology, that money doesn't really show up in people's pockets because most of them are farmers, and there isn't as much investment in farming. So we have to rethink how we view development. Now, if we go beyond that, I'm sure you've seen the narrative once more that poverty in Africa as a whole, or sub-Saharan Africa, is dropping. But if you actually look at the numbers, you see that in 1981, for example, the number of poor people was 200 million. To be precise, 205 million. If you fast forward to 2010, that number has doubled to 414 million. Now, you would agree with me that that's a problem. In the midst of the narratives that Africa is rising and development is improving, you can't have the number of poor people doubling. That is an issue. I know you're brilliant people, you're probably thinking, now, there's high increase in population. But this is the only continent where that is happening. I'm sure other continents and locations are also seeing an increase in population. Now, if you look at this graph, you see that people under 75 cents spent a day, they are still struggling. It hasn't changed that much. Furthermore, the problems in Africa are complicated. I'm not saying there's a simple fix. If you look at over the past decade, trillions have been thrown at African problems. They are so complex, connected to diseases, connected to poor governance. But over that time period, despite all the trillions thrown at the continent, there hasn't been a huge change in terms of wealth when you look at the global scale. If you're looking for where Africa is on this scale, look at the bottom. That's where it is. So you see the dilemma. Something has to change. Something has to be different. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. I think someone called that insanity. And I think that's what we see in development. I believe that in order to change this, we have to put the power of changing Africa back into the hands of the people in Africa. I think it's time for the businessman to change his thinking. Instead of saying, it's business will create the jobs that people need and solve all the problems, I think that mindset has to change. And the mindset of the charity founder has to change that, hey, charity is the solution to all problems. That has to change. I think the two have to come together to figure out the problem. I told you that the number of poor people doubled from 200 million to 400 million. And we have to figure out a way to bring business and charity together to fix that problem. Personally, I think one of the ways, and one of the key ways this can be done, is through social businesses or social enterprises. This can be a standalone organizations. I'm sure you've probably seen a few. Or it can be added on a charity that gets donations from people interested in investing in a social need can say, hey, we want this amount of money we get from our donors to magnify, to figure out a way how that money can be reused over and over again, recycled, so that it has a bigger impact instead of just throwing money at a problem and not seeing any changes. I believe this is where impact and profits matter as much as anything else. There has to be a balance between the two. I think gone are the days when we think, oh, business and non-profits are two separate things. At the end of the day, we are all vowing to change lives and improve lives through what we do. Now, let me tell you a story about where I think this could have been applied in Uganda, just so you have a context of what social businesses and social enterprises might mean. So, if you're traveling in Uganda from the capital city to the rest of the country, you would usually take a bus. Not too many people drive. And this, when I went home, I took a trip from the capital to Gulu, which is about 6-hour drive. I've done that drive a number of times for a long time. And because it's a long trip, the buses usually stop for people to get refreshments. And over the years, the locations where those buses stop become marketplaces. Now you find that young people start selling produce, start selling any items that the travelers might need in order to make money. Now there is this particular location in Gulu, on my way to Gulu, where it's an area, marketplace booming with business. The past few times I've been there, it employs about 50 to 100 people selling different items. When I went back, it was no longer 50 or 100 people. it was 20 people. So I went out and decided to figure out what's going on. I asked the lady who was selling milk, I said, there used to be 100 of you, why is there only 10 of you or 20 of you? And she said, the gentleman across the street put a gas station in place and added on a convenience store. And as a result, he sees these people as competition. He wants them out of the way. And so he's kicking them out. Now, for someone who is passing by, they might see a convenience store and say, oh, that's development. And maybe it is. But let's dig deeper. He just displaced 100 people, threw them out of business. Now, those people are going to go back home. They won't be able to meet the needs of their family, provide, send kids to school. And at some point later on, a nonprofit is going to show up and say, oh, you're poor. I'm here to give you a handout. Instead of going back and figuring out where the root cause of the problem was. It's not that they can't do anything. It's that there has been a twist. Now I know the convenience store is probably adding business to the economy, and maybe it is adding to the economy. But I think there is an intersection. I think there is a place where the investor in that convenience store could have worked better with the community to come up with the best results that meet the needs, his needs for profits and the needs of the people that are in that area. I think this is just one story in Uganda, and across Africa, multiple stories. But these stories are what's contributing to increasing poverty across Africa, despite the fact that we see corporations and businesses growing. Now, from the 19th century belief that Africa was a dark continent to now, there's been growth. But Africa has failed to turn that growth into economic development for its people. And I think that's where we have to start rethinking what we are doing and go back and draw out how to initiate social enterprises and put them at the center of what we are doing. Now, every generation, I think, always says, this is the time that Africa is going to develop and be different. And every time, it's a dream deferred. We don't see it. We promise and never deliver. And I think we need to go back to the root cause of all these issues and realize that at the end of the day, if someone is better off, that's good for business. Business back in the day was all about stakeholders who were concentrating on the income and the profits generated. Nowadays, that definition of profit is different. It involves people, it involves communities. And that's where we need to start putting social enterprises at the center of developing the African continent. Thank you very much.